This is San Francisco, the heart of one of the world's most modern state. A city of the future built on a secret. Just a century ago, in a museum at the center of this city's rising skyline, a man lived who was the very last of his kind. He came from a vanished world, one the city was built upon and one it chose to forget. And his story begins with a question. What does it cost to build a new world? The silence was a fortress. For 3 years he was utterly alone. For nearly 50 years his people had been ghosts, vanished from the earth. Then one day in August 1911, a ghost walked out of the canyon, a Yahi. A gaunt, starving man emerged from the brush-covered foothills just outside the bustling town of Oroville, California. His hair was burned short in the Yahi sign of deep mourning. Disoriented and weakened, he stumbled into a slaughterhouse corral. The butchers found him, and the whispers began immediately. Wild man! In the language of the day, this meant a savage, a subhuman creature, a remnant of a primitive past. But the man they cornered was no phantom. He was the last living thread of a people the world had already written into oblivion. Alarmed by the news of a wild man, the local sheriff, J.B. Weber, was summoned to take charge of the situation, to prevent a panic or a lynching. With no other protocol for a man without a language, without a people, and without a country, he placed him in the Oroville jail for his own protection. By morning, the headlines screamed the arrival of the last wild Indian. But this was no wild man. He was the last of the Yahi. And to understand the profound tragedy of his appearance, we must travel back through the silence, back through the loss, to the complete world that was shattered. Before California was a state, before it was even a name on a map, there were the Yahi. The southernmost band of the Yana Nation. They had lived for more than 2,500 years in the deeply cut canyons of Deer Creek and Mill Creek in the northern Sierra Nevada. This was a land of abundance. Oak trees dropped their acorns in plenty. Chinook salmon fought their way up the clear streams, and deer, elk, and rabbit moved through in regular, predictable rhythms. To the Yahi, it was a home crafted by the Creator, a living library of memory, spirit, and law. They were a small, intimate people, a community of just 200 to 300 souls, within a larger Yana population of about 1,500 to 2,000 spread across the broader region. And in their world, time wasn't a clock. It was a turning seasons. Their lives moved with the seasons. Think about that. In the fall, they'd gather acorns. They'd crack the shells, wash away the bitterness, and create a sweet, sustaining flour. In spring, they waited by the rivers, fishing salmon with ingenious basket traps woven from willow. Summer meant blackberries and manzanita berries on the sun-drenched ridges and nutritious roots dug from the canyon floor. Winter meant huddling together in their semi-subterranean earth lodges, smoke rising from central hearths as the elders told stories, legends of the creation, of Coyote the trickster, of survival and the spirit in all things. But these stories, these seasons, this entire way of being, it was all held together by a single living force, their language. The Yahi tongue was more than words. It was the architect of their reality. You couldn't just say, I am here. The language anchored you, tying your identity to that specific rock, that sacred bend in the river. To speak was to activate your place in a living network. This was the ultimate secret of their survival. They weren't just living on the land. They were in constant, sacred conversation with it. In their world, every plant, every animal, every stream was a relative. They weren't just surviving, they were home. Their life wasn't easy, but it was whole. But this universe was about to be annihilated by a gold rush. In January 1848, gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill, in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada, about 120 miles south of Yahi territory. The news sparked a global frenzy. By 1849, tens of thousands of mostly young single men, called the 49ers, surged into California from the eastern United States, Europe, Latin America, and China. They came with a singular, desperate mindset: to get rich by any means necessary, They saw land as property, nature as a resource to be exploited, and native peoples as obstacles to progress, or worse, as less than human. For the Yahi, this wasn't an arrival, it was an invasion. Settlers' cattle devoured the native grasses. Their hydraulic mining operations, blasting entire hillsides with high-pressure water, choked the rivers with silt, destroying the salmon runs and poisoning the water with mercury used to process gold. The conflict was immediate and brutal. But this wasn't random violence. This was something far more chilling. It was organized. It was official. In 1851, California's first governor, Peter Burnett, stood up and didn't just call for war. He used the word extermination. He was sanctioning the erasure of an entire people. In response, vigilante militias formed informal paramilitary groups, like the Oroville Guards and the Jarboe Rangers. These were not official state troops, but they operated with the state's tacit approval and financial support. Their primary weapon was the bounty. Scalps were the proof of a kill, trophies in a war intended to erase an entire people. A full scalp with the ears attached, which was harder to fake, could fetch $25, while a single scalp might bring $5. The distinction was purely economic, a grisly incentive for a thorough job. The campaigns of the 1860s, particularly the Mill Creek Massacre and the Dry Camp Massacre, a site on the ridge between Mill and Deer Creeks, left Yahi bodies unburied, families shattered, and villages burned to ash. But the most devastating single blow was the Three Knolls Massacre of 1865, named for the trio of small, rounded hills where it occurred. A group of Yahi families, including a young Ishi, were gathering acorns at a traditional site when they were surrounded by a mounted militia led by a man named Robert Anderson. The militia opened fire indiscriminately. Dozens were slaughtered. Ishi, his mother, and a few others escaped by fleeing into a canyon and hiding in a cave, listening to the screams and gunshots. They became ghosts in their own land, their existence reduced to a single relentless purpose: survival. For the next 4 decades, the last Yahi survivors, their numbers dwindling from a few dozen to a handful, and finally, by around 1908, to just Ishi and his elderly mother, perfected the art of invisibility. They built tiny, hidden villages called rock shelters in the most inaccessible parts of the canyons. Their dwellings were constructed to look like natural rock formations. They walked on beds of leaves to muffle their footsteps, never broke a branch, and communicated with bird calls. They were masters of their environment, reading the warning calls of jays and the behavior of deer to know when danger was still miles away. By the 1880s, anthropologists and newspapers, seeing no sign of them, declared the Yahi extinct. But they were wrong. Deep in the canyons, a handful of hearts still beat. They lived by the faint glow of embers hidden in pits, too faint to warm, by whispers too quiet to carry beyond their shelter walls. They endured hunger when the acorn crop failed, thirst when the creeks dried, and a grief for their murdered families that was a constant, silent companion. They were a people living as ghosts in their own homeland, alive but erased from the world that had claimed the land below. Then, in 1908, a surveyor's party for a light and power company, prospecting for a new dam, stumbled upon their hidden camp. Ishi's mother, too old and frail to flee, was captured. In a heart-wrenching act of survival, Ishi was forced to leave her behind to escape. He was now completely alone. For 3 years, he lived in absolute solitude, the last ember of his people. Finally, starving and consumed by loneliness, he made a choice. In 1911, he walked out of the canyon, seeking not just food, but an end to the unbearable silence. The news of the wild man of Oroville reached the University of California's Museum of Anthropology, present-day UC Berkeley, in San Francisco. 2 anthropologists, Alfred Kroeber and Thomas Waterman, immediately understood the significance. Kroeber, a leading anthropologist who had studied the Yana, recognized that the man spoke the Yahi language, the last of its kind. They were part of a salvage anthropology movement, racing to document cultures they believed were vanishing. To them, Ishi was not a wild man. He was the last key to a locked library of human knowledge. They traveled to Oroville. Waterman, who had studied the Yana language, managed to communicate. He asked the man his name. In Yahi culture, to speak one's true name to a stranger was a powerful taboo. It could give them power over you. Instead, he gave the name he used for himself, Ishi. It simply meant man in his language. It was both a statement of his humanity and a shield for his spirit. With his mother gone and his home destroyed, Ishi made the rational choice to go with them. He was given a room in the museum, which also housed the anthropologist's offices and vast collections of artifacts. For the next 5 years, this became his home, a sanctuary of stone cases and silent objects, his living presence a bridge between two worlds that could not have been more different. In San Francisco, Ishi did more than just survive, he taught. He chipped obsidian into blades sharper than surgical steel. He bent juniper wood into powerful bows. He coaxed flame from a simple fire drill. But what looked like a demonstration to the crowd for Ishi was something else entirely. It was an act of remembrance. Every time he chipped an arrowhead, it was a prayer for the hunters gone. Every fire he sparked was for the storytellers who would never sit around it again. He was quite literally rebuilding his world from memory. To scholars like Kroeber, he was a treasured collaborator. To the public, he was a spectacle. Thousands flocked to the museum to watch the last wild Indian at work behind a glass case. He endured their stares with a quiet, profound dignity, his calm eyes and deliberate movements a silent rebuke to their fascination. He was both teacher and specimen, a living man and a living monument to his own extinction. Yet amid this dehumanizing spectacle, genuine friendship blossomed. Dr. Saxton Pope, the museum's physician, was assigned to care for Ishi. They developed a deep bond, with Pope learning the art of archery from the master, and Ishi gradually trusting the doctor with his health and his stories. Pope became his closest companion. Ishi also experienced moments of pure wonder on carefully planned outings, seeing the vast, endless Pacific Ocean for the first time, a sight that both terrified and awed him. Riding a streetcar. A house that moved. These excursions, though infrequent, were vital breaths of fresh air from his confined museum life. While Ishi lived in the museum, his northern Yana relatives were not extinct, but their situation was dire. Forced onto reservations, their populations decimated by disease and poverty, Ishi's story was the most extreme version of a tragedy affecting all California native peoples. In Ishi's life, two Californias violently collided. He walked in both, yet belonged fully to neither. That was his survival and his immense burden. In the museum workshops, firelight danced against the walls. The shadows it cast were not just his own. They were the echoes of the Yahi, flickering for the last time. In the winter of 1916, Ishi fell ill. Tuberculosis, known as the White Death, was rampant in urban centers like San Francisco and was the leading cause of death in America at the time. It was particularly fatal to Native Americans who had no inherited immunity. His friends, Kroeber and Pope, did everything in their power, but medicine in 1916 had no cure for TB. He died on March 25th at approximately 54 years of age. With him died the last living speaker of the Yahi tongue, the final breath of a world. But the violation of his culture did not end with his last breath. Before his death, Ishi had expressed his wish to his friends, particularly Pope, for a traditional Yahi burial, to be cremated with his bow and arrows so his spirit could be released. However, the scientific imperative of the era, the belief that preserving biological data from vanishing races was a paramount duty, overrode his wishes. Alfred Kroeber, who was in New York at the time, sent a frantic telegram. "If there is any talk about the interests of science, say for me that science can go to hell. We propose to stand by our friends." But he was too late. And then they performed an autopsy. In a final devastating act, all in the name of science, they removed his brain and preserved it. It was shipped to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., where it was cataloged as Specimen Num 01096. They believed they were preserving the last biological record of a vanishing race. Just think about the profound violation. The man who held his entire culture in his mind, in his memories, was taken apart. His body was partitioned, just like the land he came from. His cremated body was buried in a Colma, California cemetery. For 8 decades, this schism, the physical and spiritual division of his remains, existed. Ishi's story faded into an anthropological footnote. Then, in the 1990s, a new chapter began. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, NAGPRA, had become law, requiring institutions to return Native American human remains and cultural items to tribes. Forcing a reckoning, activists and researchers led by Art Engel of the Butte County Native American Cultural Committee began digging. They discovered the paper trail leading to the Smithsonian and the shocking truth about Ishi's brain. What followed was a 7-year campaign for repatriation. It was a complex negotiation between the Butte County group, the Smithsonian, the Redding Rancheria, and the Pitt River Tribe. The Pitt River Tribe, a confederation that includes groups closely related to the Yana, and the Redding Rancheria, a multi-tribal entity in the region, were the federally recognized tribes with the strongest cultural affiliation and legal standing to claim Ishi's remains. The negotiations were fraught, grappling with questions of which group had the right to speak for Ishi. The process revealed how much had changed since 1916. Now, Native voices were leading the conversation. Finally, in the fall of 2000, in a private, sacred ceremony at an undisclosed location in the ancestral Yahi homeland, land that, though scarred by logging and development, still held its essential character. The ceremony was attended by a small group of tribal leaders and activists who had fought for this moment. It was conducted away from the media to protect its sanctity. After nearly a century, the last Yahi had finally truly come home. The Yahi world did not end in one battle or one day. It ended in a series of violent pulses: raid, hunger, disease, silence, until only a single resilient ember remained. When that ember, Ishi, was extinguished, it was as if a canyon went dark. No other Yahi were ever found. And yet Ishi is not gone. His voice remains in the hundreds of stories and songs he shared with Krober and Waterman. Myths about the creation of the world, practical tales about hunting, and personal stories of survival. His hands remain in the perfect, beautiful tools he crafted, now resting behind glass in museums. His memory remains in the words he helped preserve. He became more than the last of his people. He became a mirror, forcing us to confront the most uncomfortable questions. What does it truly mean to erase a world? What does it mean to preserve a culture in a museum after you have destroyed it in life? And what is our enduring debt to the memory of the one who was forced to be its final lonely voice? Ishi, the last voice in the canyon. His story echoes still, a haunting presence in the silence left behind, challenging us to remember what was lost, to honor what was saved, and to forever question the price of a world built upon the ruins of another, and the questions that remain unanswered.